road to the house was little more than a scar through the trees, a pale wound of gravel and bone dust that swallowed the sound of hooves. Travelers said the air changed there, thickened as if remembering breath long held. By the time the house appeared through the cedar gloom, most who came that far were already too weary, too bewitched to turn back. It stood alone, neither grand nor ruined, but patient. Its shutters hung open like eyelids refusing to close, watching the forest with unbroken vigilance. Even the ivy that crept along its pale walls seemed afraid to cling too tightly, curling away from the blackened glass of its windows. Somewhere inside a clock ticked, not with time but with hunger. They said the house was once known for its hospitality, a place where travelers could rest, where suppers were hot and the host kind. But that was before the season when no one left, before the church bells stopped ringing in the valley below, and the town's children began to whisper the house's name only after dusk. On the porch, a scent drifted, faint but familiar, like roasted meat cooling under an open sky. Yet no smoke rose from the chimney. The boards beneath the front step bowed inward, as though countless feet had pressed them in but never out again. And still the shutters did not stir. Inside, the air felt too still, too watchful. Dust lay evenly over the floorboards, until you looked closer and saw they weren't dusted with ash, but with fine grains of something grey and fibrous, like ground bone. The table dominated the room, an endless length of dark oak scarred by use and time. Each chair stood ready, polished by invisible hands, the silverware placed in perfect symmetry. But what unsettled most was the plates. Every one of them bore faint scratches in the porcelain, like fingernail marks pressed too deeply, too desperately into the glaze. "Were you expected?" a voice once asked. That's what one traveler claimed, before he vanished. They said he found the house during a storm when the road behind him flooded and the trees moaned like living things. The door had already been open, light flickering inside like it had been waiting for him. He called out, but only the ticking clock answered. It was louder then, almost a heartbeat, echoing from somewhere above. He crossed the threshold. The smell of roasted flesh grew stronger, mingled now with candle wax and old fruit. The floor creaked once, twice, and then stilled, as though it too was holding its breath. "Hello?" he said. "I was told—" His voice trailed off. The table looked fuller now. The plates gleamed cleaner. For a moment he thought he saw shapes in the candlelight, silhouettes around the table, heads bowed, hands clasped. But when he blinked, there was only air. He told himself it was fatigue, the storm, his own foolish superstition. But something in the room shifted. Not sound, not sight, something deeper, like the air beneath his ribs tightening. Then came the faintest rustle. Fabric, perhaps. A whisper of skirts. A slow drag of footsteps from the kitchen doorway. A woman stood there, tall and slight, her apron stained in grey. Her face was kind but pale, her eyes reflecting the candlelight like polished coins. She smiled as one does when the expected has finally arrived. "Please," she said softly, "you must be cold." He didn't recall answering, but somehow he was seated. His coat had been hung by the hearth that no longer burned. The woman moved with grace, setting before him a bowl of stew that steamed though no fire warmed the room. He hesitated. The spoon trembled in his hand. "You've come far," she murmured, turning toward the stairwell as though to fetch something. "They always do." He almost called after her to ask who they were. But then the door at the end of the hall creaked open and he froze. A draught spilled through, carrying with it the faint murmur of voices. Soft, layered, indistinct, like prayers spoken underwater. He turned toward the sound, and every candle on the table leaned toward him, their flames stretching, trembling, eager. He rose. The door stood half open now, a dark mouth leading deeper into the house. Beyond it the whispering grew louder, words still muffled but rhythmically pulsing, as though something beneath the floor was chanting them through wood. "Leave," a voice hissed, not from beyond but from inside his head. Or perhaps it was the wind. He stumbled back toward the table, heart pounding. The chair legs scraped the floor, though none had moved. Then, without warning, the clock struck. Once, twice, though the hands did not shift. He turned to flee, but the front door had closed, and on the table, where there had been a single bowl, there were now two. The second still steamed, and beside it a folded napkin marked with his initials. He did not scream, only listened to the shutters that never moved, the ticking that did not count and the faint, wet sound of something chewing behind the walls. By morning, the road was empty again, the porch unswept, the air clean of all scent. Only the shutters remained open, waiting, refusing to close. And if you pass by the house now on quiet nights when the wind dares not breathe, you might hear the scrape of a chair, the sigh of a tired host, and the soft, dreadful clinking of a spoon meeting bone. The house is patient. It remembers every guest, and tonight, it seems, it's waiting again. There was no sound when she entered a room, only the faint stirring of air like ashes remembering fire. The house breathed differently when she moved through it, a slow, patient rhythm that seemed to follow her steps. They said her hands were always clean, pale as candle wax, though the earth beneath her feet had long since gone black. Her name had been forgotten by the living, but the house whispered it through its boards when the night grew long. A breath half swallowed. Martha or Marlin or something older still. Those who tried to say it aloud found their tongues dry as parchment and their voices too small for the sound. She did not need a name. She was the house's keeper, its caretaker, its quiet queen. She wore her apron like a relic. It was grey, always grey, not from soot or age, but from what she washed it in. Some said rainwater, others said tears. The boldest claimed it was something drawn from the well behind the orchard, the one that had been sealed since the spring of '47. They said when the lightning struck that year, it illuminated not water, but faces, sunken, pale, looking up, and yet her smile never wavered. When strangers arrived, and those weary enough to seek shelter, foolish enough to ignore the stillness of the forest, she would greet them kindly, almost lovingly. "Come in," she'd say, her voice thin as silk. "For you look starved." No one refused her, not because of fear, but because of the softness in her eyes. Eyes that promised warmth, care, understanding, though behind that gentleness lingered a patience that felt eternal, as though she had said the same words to 1,000 guests before and expected to say them to 1,000 more. The kitchen, when she entered it, came alive in strange ways. Pots shifted slightly on their hooks. The hearth breathed, though no flame was visible. And the smell, faint but sweet, seemed to crawl along the walls like ivy. Not the scent of bread or broth, but something richer, older. Closer to the iron tang of soil after rain, she would hum as she prepared the table, the tune low and circular, never quite ending, never beginning. If one listened too closely, it almost matched the ticking of the upstairs clock. Almost one stormy evening, a traveller from Richmond arrived, soaked and shivering. He said later, though no one believed him, that when she opened the door, he saw behind her not the glow of candlelight, but the faint shimmer of smoke rising from the floor. "Please," she whispered, stepping aside, "you mustn't catch cold. Supper's near." The man removed his hat, bowed slightly. "You're kind, ma'am. Kindness is rare on a road like this." Her lips curved. "Kindness is never rare here. The house insists upon it." He smiled uneasily, mistaking her words for jest. But when he looked past her into the long hall, he saw the dining table already set, plates gleaming, napkins folded, chairs pulled out just so. Every seat was taken, every goblet full, yet no one sat. The woman gestured him inside. "Wash before the meal," she said, nodding toward the basin near the door. "Clean hands make for peaceful spirits." He obeyed, though when he bent over the basin, he noticed the water glistened too darkly in the candlelight, not black, but thick, sluggish, as though carrying memory. When he looked again, it was clear as spring water. She stood behind him, her reflection absent from the mirror. "You've travelled far," she said. "Few come this way anymore." "Roads are washed out," he replied, still studying the basin. "You're a long way from town, ma'am." "How do you—" "I don't," she said softly. "The house provides." When he turned, she was gone. The air felt heavier. From somewhere deeper within came the sound of cutlery brushing porcelain, gentle, rhythmic like breathing. He followed the noise, drawn toward the dining room. The smell grew stronger now, sweet rot, perfume, something faintly copper beneath it all. The table gleamed beneath the candlelight, and at its head stood the woman, hands clasped before her, apron gleaming pale and wet. "Sit," she murmured. He hesitated. There are no others here." Her smile didn't falter. "There are always others." He sat. The food before him was unfamiliar, thick stew, pieces of something indistinct, tender, faintly pink at the edges. He raised his spoon, but before it reached his lips, he saw something move within it, a ripple like breath trapped beneath the surface. "You're shaking," she said gently, stepping closer. "You must be frightened." "That's good. Fear keeps the taste alive." The man dropped his spoon, its clatter echoing too loudly. "What did you say?" She tilted her head, eyes gleaming like candlelight caught in glass. "Eat," she whispered. "While you still can." He pushed back his chair, but the legs scraped against something soft. When he looked down, the floor was no longer wood, but ash. Layers upon layers, fine and grey, rising between the cracks, breathing upward. From beneath it came the faint outline of fingers. He stumbled back. What is this?" Her expression changed, not cruel, not kind, but ancient, tired. "The house remembers," she said. "Herd keeps what it's given." He turned to run, but the doorway behind him was gone, swallowed by shadow. The candles dimmed one by one, as her voice followed him through the dark. "I wash this apron every night," she whispered, "in water that once belonged to men like you. It never comes clean." Something cold brushed his ankle. Not a hand, but something that used to be one. He screamed. The sound was swallowed by the house. By dawn, the storm had passed. The woman in the apron of ashes stood on the porch, pale light catching the edge of her smile. She was humming again, soft, content. At her feet, the ground steamed faintly where rain met soil. The grass would not grow there, and from the kitchen window, if one looked closely, the basin gleamed red beneath the morning sun. She washed her apron again, humming. Another traveller would come soon. The house had already set the table. It began with letters that no one remembered opening, folded in parchment soft as old skin, sealed with wax that gleamed like drying blood. No messenger was ever seen. No carriage left its tracks in the mud. And yet, by nightfall, every house in the valley seemed to possess one. The people told themselves they'd misplaced it, that it had come weeks ago, that it was simply another summons from the church or a neighbour's kindness. But when they looked again, their own names were written across the envelope in a hand too elegant, too knowing. The ink was red, not crimson like paint, but a deeper hue, as if the paper itself had been wounded to bear the message. It read only this: "You are expected at supper." No date, no signature, no address, and yet everyone knew where to go. The house on the hill, the one whose windows glowed when no one lived there, the one whose shutters never closed. They came in silence. Men and women who barely spoke by daylight found themselves drawn by night, as if compelled by memory not their own. The path twisted through the cedars like a serpent's spine. Each step closer, the air grew denser, filled with the faint scent of burning tallow and something sweet rotting underneath. The wind did not blow. The stars did not show. Only the sound of shoes pressing against earth that seemed to hum faintly, almost welcoming. When the first of them reached the porch, the door was already ajar. Candlelight shimmered within, and somewhere beyond it came the distant rhythmic sound of cutlery tapping porcelain, steady, patient, eternal. They hesitated. Then the bell rang. It wasn't loud. Just a single low toll, like a warning whispered from beneath the soil. The wax candles flared higher. A woman stood in the doorway. Her apron gleamed grey in the glow, her eyes gentle and unreadable. "You've come," she murmured, as if speaking to each of them by name. The house has been waiting. The guests exchanged uncertain looks. No one recalled agreeing to come, yet none could leave. There was an invisible pressure, a quiet insistence behind their ribs, drawing them forward like fish pulled by a slow, unseen current. Inside, the table was already set. Plates of bone-white porcelain gleamed under a dozen flickering candles. Goblets filled themselves with dark wine, their surfaces trembling as though from a heartbeat beneath the wood. The chairs, and too many to count, waited patiently, facing the head of the table where no one yet sat. "Please," the woman said, her voice a sigh through the room. "Take your places. You mustn't keep the house hungry." They sat. They did not speak. One by one, the candles brightened. Shadows crept up the walls and began to take form, faint outlines of figures that should not have been there. Some leaned forward, some clasped invisible hands, some simply watched with hollow patience. A man near the end of the table swallowed hard. Who sent for us?" he asked. The woman tilted her head. "Didn't you?" He blinked, confused. You must have," she continued, smiling softly. "The house doesn't write letters. It only answers them." A silence fell, heavy, suffocating. One of the guests reached into his coat and pulled out his invitation. The parchment was damp, warm to the touch. He looked closer. The words were fading, replaced by new ones blooming across the surface in fresh red strokes. He gasped. It's changing." The woman stepped closer. "Yes, it does that when it's nearly time." "Time for what?" Another whispered, her eyes glimmered. "For remembrance." The letters pulsed, bright as veins in firelight, before settling into new words, the name of the guest who held it. Beneath it, in smaller script, "Return to sender." He dropped it. The paper hit the floor with a wet sound. The others rose, chairs scraping against wood that sounded too soft, too yielding. The candles swayed violently, though there was no breeze. From somewhere deep within the walls came a low, rhythmic thudding, like fists knocking from beneath the floorboards. The woman's voice broke through it, calm, almost soothing. "Don't be afraid," she said. "You've been here before." "No," a woman cried. "I haven't." "You have." Her tone sharpened, though her smile never did. "So you just don't remember leaving." And then, as the room darkened, they saw it, faint silhouettes moving behind their own reflections in the window panes. Each figure matched them perfectly. Their gestures, their panic, their trembling. Except the reflections did not mouth the same words. The reflections were smiling. The bell tolled again, lower this time, rattling the glass. One of the guests stumbled toward the door, but it had already sealed shut. The wax from the candles had melted down the walls, sealing every exit in a slow, oozing cascade. The air smelled of iron and honey. The woman in the apron of ashes stood at the head of the table now, resting her hands upon the wood. Her fingers were long, jointed oddly, too flexible, like the hinges of a puppet. "Your seats are marked," she whispered. "The house has written your names upon them. You may as well stay." A man lunged toward her, shouting, "What are you?" She turned, the candlelight bending strangely around her face. "An answer," she said softly, "to every invitation you've ever ignored." Then the flames went out. In the sudden dark, the last thing they heard was the tearing of parchment. Long, wet, deliberate, and the faint echo of chairs shifting closer to the table. By morning, the road to the house was empty again. The townsfolk found the valley silent, but on the porch a new stack of invitations lay neatly arranged. The ink was still fresh, still red, still pulsing faintly like veins. Each envelope bore a single name, the names of those who had come, and one more, written last in steadier hand, you. If you've reached this far into the supper, consider yourself a guest already. Subscribe to Forgotten Census before the candles go out, and like this video to keep the house from remembering your name too soon. The table was already set when the sun died behind the cypress trees. No one had seen who prepared it, yet each plate gleamed faintly in the dim candlelight, not from polish, but from something oily and alive that caught the light wrong. Like the surface of an old pond too still to be trusted, the air was heavy with the smell of boiled roots, copper, and something faintly sweet, the sweetness that comes when fruit begins to rot in its own skin. They entered the room one by one, each guest careful not to meet the other's eyes, because here in the old Caraway house, looking too long meant remembering too much. The hostess, Mrs. Caraway, stood at the head of the table, her lace collar yellowed by time, and her hair pinned too tightly for someone breathing. Yet she smiled that Virginian smile, the one that could curdle milk and charm a priest in the same breath. The plates were bone, the silver blackened from years of warmth that wasn't from fire. Each dish steamed though no one saw a kitchen, and those who bowed their heads to pray heard an extra voice among them, soft, pleading ancient. They said grace anyway because that was the custom here, because to stop would mean acknowledging the sound was real. The prayer moved like smoke over their lips. Lord bless this meal and those who made it. But when they reached the end, another line joined in, trembling through the air like a breath caught between ribs. And those who were made into it, a silence fell that felt older than the house. Then came the first course, thick stew ladled from a tarnished tureen, heavy with meat that pulled apart like old silk. Someone whispered that it tasted familiar, like Sunday afternoons when the slaves still sang in the fields. But that voice was swallowed by the scrape of spoons and the hum of low conversation. At the far end of the table sat an empty chair, though the napkin beside it was stained and folded neatly, as if someone had only stepped away every now and then. A fork lifted from that space, moved slightly, and then set itself down again, leaving a faint ring of broth around the untouched plate. "Mrs. Carroway," said a guest, his voice too tight for the warmth he tried to force into it, "you always feed us so well. Where do you find such tender cuts?" She smiled, her eyes gleaming with the reflection of every candle. "From the kindness of those who stay," they laughed, though none of them liked the sound of it. The walls were listening, and the portraits, those large oil faces of Carroways long gone, seemed to lean forward. Their eyes blacker now, their mouths slightly less painted. Every time someone passed by them, a faint scent of damp soil rose up, like earth disturbed too soon after burial. Halfway through the meal, a draught slipped through the room, making the candles bow low, and in that trembling light they saw it, fingerprints on the inside of every glass, pressed from within, fogging up the crystal as though the drink itself had remembered breathing. Mrs. Carroway lifted her glass unbothered. "Two old friends," she said, and for a moment everyone raised theirs in trembling imitation, but before they could drink, a single drop of dark red slipped down from the ceiling, thick, viscous, and warm, landing in her cup with a sound like a sigh she drank anyway. Outside, the cicadas went quiet. The house itself seemed to inhale, and somewhere, under the table, something shifted, a soft dragging, as if fingers traced along the wood. Searching for the pulse of whoever sat above, a young girl at the far end began to weep silently, her tears clear and endless, her hands clasped around something she dared not open, a locket that throbbed faintly against her skin, like a heartbeat caught in metal. When Mrs. Carroway's voice rose again, it was lower, slower, worn thin by centuries of hosting. "It is rude," she murmured, eyes on the girl, "to refuse what is freely given." The girl's hands shook, the locket creaked open on its own inside. A photograph, not hers. A child's face gone grey with time, but behind it, tucked beneath the glass, was something wet and glistening, the curled, blackened edge of flesh folded small as a ribbon. Every guest froze, waiting for the scream that should have come, but only a long, slow breath filled the room, winding between their throats, circling them like a prayer being recited backward. Mrs. Carroway smiled again. "The departed must be fed," she said softly, "or they will come hungry next time." The candles flared once, bright as daylight, and then all went out when the room fell into darkness. Every guest felt a hand on their shoulder, gentle, familiar, and impossibly cold, and from somewhere just beneath the table, a voice whispered, "Don't forget to finish your plate." Then came the sound, a porcelain cracking, silver falling, and the slow, rhythmic scrape of chairs being pulled away one by one. The supper continued long after the candles died, and when the light returned with dawn, only the empty chair remained, its napkin freshly folded, waiting for the next who would stay a little too long in the warmth that wasn't from fire. The name he spoke was not meant for the living. It came out cracked, trembling, and half-swallowed, the kind of sound that doesn't pass through lips so much as it escapes from somewhere deeper, from a place that remembers being buried. The guests had been pretending not to notice the chill that had crept into the dining room since the last course, though the air had grown colder than the night beyond the windows, and the cypress shadows outside seemed to lean closer to the glass as if listening. He raised his glass higher, a trembling hand, veins showing like ink through parchment, and for a brief, terrible moment, the wine inside it moved against gravity, a rippling upward as if drawn towards something above. "To our gracious hostess," he began, though his eyes were not on Mrs. Carroway, "and to the one who could not be with us tonight." The others looked to their plates, anything to avoid asking who he meant, but silence had a way of thickening in that room, pressing against their ribs until someone broke it, and when no one did, the house itself answered. It began as a clinking sound, faint and almost polite, the delicate ring of silver against porcelain, but there were too many of them. Too many forks and knives moving for the number of people seated. The candles shivered, one by one, and their light grew longer, thinner, until the flames leaned toward the center of the table, all pointing to the empty chair. Mrs. Carroway did not flinch, though her smile had stiffened, her teeth showing white and sharp against the dark wine stain at the corner of her mouth. Now, she whispered, her voice sweet as embalming fluid, "let's not summon what's already here." The man who had spoken, Mr. Holloway they called him, swallowed hard, lowering his glass, but the damage was done, and everyone knew it somewhere beneath the floorboards. Something began to stir, a sound like dragging chains over wet wood, followed by a slow, deliberate tapping that kept time with the man's heartbeat. He tried to speak again, to laugh, to say he meant no harm, but his words stuck to his tongue like cobwebs from the far end of the table. The young girl, the one who had cried through supper, had whispered, "You shouldn't have said her name, though no one had told her what it was, Mr." Holloway turned to her, face pale as unbaked clay. "What did you say?" She blinked, her pupils widening until her eyes were nothing but darkness. "She's listening." The lights dimmed again, and in that instant between flickers, they all saw it. Another figure seated in the empty chair. Faint, colorless, more shadow than flesh, head bowed as though praying. When the candlelight steadied, the chair was empty again. But the plate before it was no longer clean. Something black had pooled there, thick, glistening, spreading outward, the smell sharp and coppery. And one by one the guests realized it was seeping across the tablecloth toward their plates. Mrs. Carraway raised her hand, calm and slow. "It's all right," she said softly. "She only wants to be remembered." But the blackness did not stop. And with every inch it spread, the portraits on the walls seemed to breathe, their painted eyes glistening with wetness that wasn't paint, mister. Holloway's hand trembled around his glass, the wine now pale as water. "I didn't mean to—" "Intent is for the living," Mrs. Carraway murmured, her voice low enough that only the nearest could hear. "She belongs to the spoken." The girl across the table began to hum, a tune that made no sense, rising and falling like the rhythm of waves against a coffin lid, and soon others joined without knowing why, their lips moving to words they didn't remember learning, and beneath it all, a whisper slipped through, not one voice but many, layered and decayed, speaking from the corners of the room, from the cracks in the plaster, from the silver itself. "Drink, and you'll see her too, mister." Holloway lifted his glass without meaning to. The moment the wine touched his lips, his eyes rolled upward, his body stiffened, and a drop of red slipped from his ear. He spoke no more, but his reflection in the darkened window smiled and lifted its glass in return. The other guests sat frozen, their minds dividing between fear and obedience, waiting for Mrs. Carraway to end it. But she only sighed. As if relieved. "It was rude," she said quietly, almost lovingly, "to make her wait this long." The house groaned, not from the wind but from something within its bones, timbers warping as though making room for more. The candles flared again, revealing that the empty chair was no longer empty. And this time she did not hide herself in shadow. Her skin was grey and waxen, her hair braided tight as rope, and her mouth, when it moved, did not open. The sound came from behind her teeth, wet and fluttering. "You spoke my name. Holloway, now you will speak for me," he began to whisper, not in his own voice, but hers, words that no one understood, syllables from some older Virginia, a language of the dead. The glasses rattled, then shattered, wine splattering like blood across the white linen, and the air filled with the sharp hiss of steam rising from the blackened plates. When it ended, Mr. Holloway's body sat limp in his chair, eyes open, throat moving faintly as if trying to finish the toast. Mrs. Carraway raised her own glass again, and though her smile was still gentle, her shadow on the wall behind her had grown long enough to reach the floorboards. "To the departed," she whispered. Every guest, trembling, followed her lead, and from the plate before the grey woman's chair, a single hand rose, colourless and dripping, to clink its invisible glass against theirs. The sound rang clear, bright and terribly final. Then, from deep in the walls, something answered the toast, not with words, but with a single hollow laugh that echoed through the bones of the house. Shaking dust from the chandeliers, outside the cypress branches began to bend, all in the same direction, toward the dining room window, and in that moment, each guest understood that the toast had been accepted, but the silence it broke would never settle again. There are few silences more unbearable than one shared between a hungry man and a waiting table. He sat there, trembling in the candlelight, the plate before him steaming with something that should not have been warm, a piece of meat, pale as parchment, glistening, pulsing softly as if remembering how to breathe. The others were gone, though he could still hear the faint clinking of cutlery somewhere deeper in the house, like echoes that had forgotten their owner's. Mr. Keene was his name, a traveller, a surveyor by trade, the man who claimed he'd eaten from many kitchens across the south, but none had ever stared back at him from the plate. "Eat, dear," came Mrs. Carraway's voice, smooth and hushed, from the head of the table. It's ruder to let it cool than to refuse it. He managed a thin smile, though his stomach coiled at the smell. Not rot, not spice, but something salt-sweet. Almost human. I'm afraid I've no appetite, he whispered, fingers tightening around the fork. Oh, but you do? She replied, rising from her chair. Her apron white and spotless, though smoke stains ringed her sleeves. You wouldn't have come all this way if you didn't hunger for something. Behind her the candles hissed, a thin hiss, like air escaping a wound, and he saw for just a moment that the wax wasn't melting down, but crawling up, as though the flames were feeding in reverse. The meat quivered, a bead of clear fluid slipping from its edge and running down the plate, curving toward him. Deliberate. Serpentine, he pushed back from the table, chair screeching, but the legs caught on the warped floorboards, and in that second of hesitation, Mrs. Carroway reached out and steadied the dish before him. Her touch was gentle, tender, the way a mother calms a frightened child. It's only polite, she said softly, to finish what's begun. When he looked down again, the meat had changed. It was thinner now, spread wider across the plate as if trying to take shape. And he saw it, clear as breath on a mirror, the faint outline of a hand pressing from beneath its surface. He stifled a sound, somewhere between a prayer and a curse. Tell me, she said, walking slowly around the table, her shadow stretching long. Do you know what you taste when you swallow fear? He couldn't answer. Her footsteps stopped behind him, and something, soft damp, brushed his shoulder. The smell of ash and iron thick in the air, Faith, she whispered. You taste faith. The plate trembled faintly at first, then stronger, as though something beneath it wanted to rise, and suddenly the edges of the dish curled upward like petals under heat. He stood, stumbled backward, eyes wide, and that's when he saw the chairs, all 9 of them, still warm, each indent in the cushion shaped like a body that had only just left, steam rising faintly from where backs and hands had rested. Where are the others? He asked, the words brittle as frost misses. Carroway tilted her head, her smile as slow as a clock unwinding. They've moved on, Mr. Keene, to the part of supper that needs no table. He turned toward the door, but the handle twisted itself before he could touch it, metal groaning as though gripped from the other side, and the candlelight dimmed to a colorless blue. A whisper slipped through the room then, faint echoing from all directions. Swallow, swallow, swallow. He clutched his throat, though nothing had yet touched him, and still he felt it, the weight of something pressing upward from his stomach, as if memory itself had turned solid inside him. Mrs. Carroway leaned close to his ear. You think you came to eat, but you came to be eaten. The floorboards swelled under his feet. He could feel warmth rising through them, and for the first time he realized that the wood beneath him was wet, slick with something that pulsed faintly like veins beneath skin. He fell to his knees, gasping, and when his hands hit the floor, they came away dark, not with dirt, not with wine, but with something thicker, older, that stuck to his palms and began to crawl. The plate before him shuddered, the pale flesh upon it arching upward like breath caught in prayer, and before he could move it leapt into his mouth, forcing itself past his teeth, slick and relentless. He choked, clawed at his throat, eyes bulging, but Mrs. Carroway only watched, expression serene. See? She murmured. You were hungry after all. He fell sideways, gasping, throat convulsing as the thing slid deeper, writhing, and then, horribly, it stilled. His breathing slowed, the room quieted for a moment. Nothing moved but the trembling candle flames. Then, slowly he stood. His posture was wrong and stiff, puppet-like, and when he turned, his eyes shone with that same faint blue as the candlelight misses. Carroway smiled approvingly, brushing her hands together as if dusting flour from them. Now then, she said. Another guest satisfied, but the voice that came from Mr. Keene's mouth was not his own. It was many voices, layered, whispering over each other like dry leaves. We are still hungry. The windows fogged, though no one breathed near them, and as Mrs. Carroway turned toward the hallway, the voices followed, crawling along the walls, whispering through the cracks. In the dining room, the chairs began to rock gently, as if someone unseen had returned to sit. The candles bowed lower, flames bending as if pulled downward toward the floor, and in the center of the table, the empty plate gleamed, clean once more, waiting for the next course, but from beneath it came a faint sound, muffled and wet, a tongue against porcelain, slowly licking, slowly waiting, Outside, the night wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and iron through the trees, and from the woods beyond the house, where no road led, came the low toll of a bell that hadn't rung in 100 years, it tolled once, deep, hollow, final, and somewhere in the dark. Another place set its table. It began with a single drop, soft, deliberate, almost polite. The kind of sound that wouldn't trouble anyone if not for the way it refused to stop. Drip. Pause, drip again, measured, certain, like something beneath the floor was keeping time with a pulse it shouldn't have. Mrs. Caraway sat at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly atop the cloth that now shimmered faintly in the candlelight, the way fabric does when it's wet, when it's hiding something that wants to breathe. The guests were gone, or rather, what had been them had gone silent, their warmth still clinging to the air, their shadows faintly imprinted on the wallpaper, as though they'd burned themselves into it before leaving. Only she remained, and the man who now wore Mr. Keen's body like a borrowed suit, he stood motionless beside her, chest rising too slowly, eyes unfocused, his jaw twitching every so often, as if trying to remember how it used to move. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, motherly and cruel in equal measure. He didn't answer. "That sound," she continued, tapping one long finger against the wood beneath the linen. "It's older than this house, older than any of us. But it only stirs when it's been well fed." The drip came again, a little louder now, closer, and a tremor ran through the table. The silverware rattled against the plates, soft metallic chimes that rose like the sound of insects in summer, delicate, endless, mindless. Mrs. Caraway leaned forward, whispering as if to the table itself, "Are you satisfied?" There was a pause, long and terrible, and then the tablecloth twitched, not the way fabric moves from air or wind, but the way a lung shudders after a held breath. Mr. Keen's hand, or whatever guided it, twitched too, as though answering the same unseen pulse, his fingers stretching, flexing, then slowly reaching toward the cloth. When he touched it, the white turned red under his palm, not in a sudden bloom, but a slow soaking spread, the kind that comes from within. He recoiled, but the cloth clung to him, threads tightening like veins, the stain crawling up his wrist, pulsing with its own rhythm. "You shouldn't touch before it asks," Mrs. Caraway said, though there was no anger in her tone, only the resigned fondness of someone correcting a child's manners. He fell to his knees, clawing at the fabric, but it only sank deeper into him, threads disappearing beneath his skin, as though stitching him to the table. The drip had stopped now. Instead came a soft gurgle, a sound like breath drawn through water. The candlelight flickered again, and for the briefest second the room seemed wider, taller, as if the walls had shifted outward to make space, and beneath the table, something sighed. It was not human. It was the sound of old wood exhaling, of deep, damp earth moving, of something that had waited long enough. Mrs. Caraway closed her eyes, murmuring, "It's been so long since it's eaten from the same hand twice." The red stain reached the center of the table, forming a perfect circle, dark as oil, glistening, and then it began to pulse slowly at first, then faster, each throb in time with Mr. Keen's heartbeat, until the rhythm between them blurred, his chest rising and falling in sync with the living cloth beneath him. He tried to scream, but when his mouth opened, what came out wasn't sound. It was a ribbon of blood rising upward, twisting in the candlelight like smoke. The table responded, trembling, groaning, the plates shaking violently before settling again, each one now holding something that hadn't been there before, a scrap of skin, a tooth, a curl of hair. "Every house has its appetite," Mrs. Caraway whispered, standing slowly. "But this one, oh, this one remembers names." The ceiling above them creaked, dust drifting down like ash, and a faint red stain began to bloom in the wood overhead, mirroring the one on the table. She looked up, smiling faintly. "See? It's climbing now, just like it used to." From beneath the table came another sigh, louder this time, wetter, and a faint scraping sound, as though claws or nails were tracing the underside of the floorboards. "Seeking a way out, don't fight it," she murmured, leaning close to the trembling man. "It's only asking for what was promised." The cloth moved again, lifting slightly, and for the first time he saw what lay beneath. There was no wood there anymore, no floor, only a dark, slow-moving surface that reflected the candlelight in ripples, thick and red, stretching endlessly downward into blackness, the blood beneath the tablecloth. The house had been built on it, or perhaps from it, a living foundation that had fed on generations of gratitude and fear. Mrs. Carraway's smile softened, wistful now, almost loving. Every meal is a covenant. You see, and every refusal leaves a debt unpaid. She placed one hand on the table. Fingers splayed, and the red circle beneath her hand began to rise, not as liquid, but as flesh, forming the faint impression of a face pressing upward from underneath. The lips moved first, mouthing soundless words before giving shape to a single whisper that was not hers. More, mister. Keen screamed then, and not in terror, but in recognition, and the table answered him. The wood split, cleanly and deep, a single jagged line running down its center as the cloth tore open, revealing the writhing mass beneath, tendrils slick and red, curling upward, searching for mouths, for warmth, for breath. Mrs. Carraway did not move away. She only whispered, "It's time for the blessing." The tendrils reached her first, wrapping around her arms, her throat, her face, yet she smiled as they did, her voice rising through the gurgle of feeding. "Let the house remember," she said, and then the candles went out, the last thing visible before. The dark consumed everything was the movement. Beneath the torn cloth, the slow folding of red shapes, like a hand pressing through from the other side, reaching for the next plate. Then silence, only the faint sound of dripping returned, steady, patient, unhurried drip. Pause, drip again, and in that pause between beats, something heavy shifted in the dark, as if pulling its weight toward the parlor door, toward the next room, toward the next chapter. They said the mirror had been hung only to catch candlelight, to make the feasts appear more full, more alive, but no one could recall who first brought it into the dining hall of Hollow Marsh House, nor who decided it should face the table where the family gathered each night. As if to witness them eat, the thing stood tall, a gilt frame dulled by centuries of greasy smoke and whispered grace, its surface rippling faintly like a pond, disturbed by a slow, unseen breath. And though every other mirror in the house gave back the expected faces, this one reflected only absence, an empty table, set as if for a meal that would never come, save for the shape at its head, seated, still and watching. When supper was served, no one dared glance at it for long, but always the youngest, the curious, the disobedient, would sneak a look and freeze mid-bite, their spoons trembling, their eyes glassy, like something within them was trying to remember its name. It began after the autumn rains, when the river behind Hollow Marsh flooded its banks, and the servants swore the water turned red as it soaked the soil. They said the old mirror had started to hum then, faintly, a tone like a voice buried under layers of glass, low, persistent, like a prayer or a warning. Lady Corintha, the mistress of the house, claimed she heard her late husband in that hum. She began setting his chair at the head again, pouring wine into his untouched glass, speaking to the empty space between herself and the mirror as though it answered. And perhaps in some way it did, because the nights grew longer after that. The clocks hesitated, the candles bent toward the glass as if drawn by its breath, and in the morning guests whispered that they had heard laughter echoing from the dining hall, laughter that did not belong to any living voice. When the vicar came to bless the house, he covered the mirror with a heavy black cloth, but by dawn it had slipped to the floor, and the cloth was damp, not with water but with something darker, something that smelled of rust and soil. Servants began to vanish next, quietly, as if the walls had swallowed them. Their names were erased from the household ledger, their rooms cleaned, their beds remade. No one asked questions anymore, for questions, like reflections, had become dangerous things. One night, the youngest daughter, Miriam, stood before the mirror after the meal and said softly, "I can see us all, but no one's eating." Her mother told her to hush, but the girl's reflection kept moving, spoon rising, mouth chewing. Long after Miriam herself had turned away the following morning, they found her chair empty, her plate licked clean, and her reflection, and they swore, still seated there, smiling faintly by winter. No one ate at the table at all. The family took their meals standing, glancing only at the floor, while the mirror behind them reflected a feast in progress. Dozens of figures seated and chewing in perfect silence, each with eyes that gleamed like glass, each raising a cup in a toast that no one ever heard. When the house was finally abandoned, decades later, the mirror was left behind, its frame warped with age, its surface still faintly glowing in the dark. And if one stands before it now, and waits long enough, They say the reflection begins to breathe again. The table slowly fills, and the head of the table, that seated figure, turns toward you at last, its mouth parting as if to welcome you home. And the only thing reflected in its eyes is your own empty chair waiting. It was said that time itself had lost its appetite that night, that it stopped to watch them eat. A long, unblinking pause in the throat of the world. No one knew when the meal began, only that it had not stopped since the previous dusk. And the candles, 12 thick pillars of tallow, stood as tall as when they were lit, their flames unmoving, their smoke hanging mid-air like strings pulled taut by unseen fingers. The grand table at Hollowmarsh groaned under the weight of abundance. Golden pheasants, fruits long out of season, bread so fresh it still steamed, and silver goblets brimming with wine that never spilled. No matter how many trembling hands reached for them, the guests had changed when, or rather, they had begun to forget the shape of themselves. Forks moved, mouths opened, but the sound of chewing was dampened. As if the air itself had turned viscous, every swallow echoed like the turn of a clock gear that refused to stop, at first. They laughed. That hollow laughter of people too polite to question dread. They raised their glasses to the host, though none could recall who had invited them. And when the steward passed again and again with new platters, they smiled with glazed eyes, as though their hunger had become an obedience. The musicians in the corner played a waltz that never resolved, a circling tune that began to slip out of rhythm, each note bleeding into the next until it was just one long whisper, an undercurrent of breath that grew colder the longer it went on. Then came the moment no one could name, when one of the guests, Lord Penning perhaps, or what was left of him, tried to stand but his body refused, as though the chair beneath him had grown roots into the floorboards. His hand quivered, reaching toward the door, and the knife beside his plate slid across the table, not falling, not scraping, simply gliding as though drawn toward something unseen across from him. Lady Corinthi smiled with cracked lips and whispered, "We must not leave before Grace." Her voice sounded borrowed, as though it had passed through another mouth before reaching hers outside. The carriages waited, their horses motionless, their flesh sinking inward, eyes hollowing into pits where flies had made their thrones. The coachmen hung limp in their seats, faces turned toward the house, as if listening for a summons that would never come inside. The food no longer decayed. It regenerated, each cut of meat restoring itself, each loaf reforming, as though the table demanded to remain whole, and the guests, pitiful, obedient, obliged it by continuing the ritual of eating. "Do you remember," someone murmured, "when we first sat down?" But no one answered, because no one remembered anymore if there had been a beginning at all, only the ticking sound, faint, constant, like droplets falling from a ceiling you cannot see, counted the endless hours between each hollow swallow. The air thickened with something sweet and rotten, like lilies left too long in the sun, and one by one the guests began to droop, not sleeping, not waking, but sinking into a quiet rhythm, their faces tilting forward until their mouths hovered over their plates again, their hands moving automatically, fork, knife, bite, chew, as if the act itself sustained the illusion of life. When the youngest servant tried to flee, the door refused to open, her reflection in the glass lingering a moment longer than her body, still seated, still serving, even as her shadow staggered backward down the corridor. Her eyes black with the knowledge that she had not truly left by the third dawn, though the sun no longer touched the windows. The feast had become a liturgy of consumption, an endless offering to a host no one could name, only feel, watching from somewhere just beyond the edge of the tablecloth. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, someone new appeared among the guests, a stranger dressed in the style of another century, nodding politely, raising a cup and beginning to eat. Now the house stands empty, but if you listen through the cracked shutters, you'll hear the clink of cutlery, the murmur of voices caught between prayers, and the scrape of chairs that have long forgotten their masters. And when you peer through the window, you might see them still, candles unburnt, wine unspilled, a table that never rots, and at its head a figure smiling faintly, turning toward the light that dares to enter, its mouth moving in slow, deliberate rhythm as if to say, "Sit, the feast is not yet over." And somewhere beyond the walls a horse exhales one final breath, steam curling through its hollow ribs, before it stills forever, harness creaking in what sounds very much like prayer. It began with the hum, that low, lilting tune too calm for the hour. A melody that did not rise or fall, only circled, as if meant to keep something in, rather than soothe something out. The woman in the apron stood alone in the dining hall of Hollowmarsh, the same hall where time had stopped 3 nights prior, her fingers trembling as she laid the final napkin. Folded perfectly, creased like a shroud over white bone. The table stretched farther than memory, its edges lost in the dimness, its silver glinting faintly like a line of distant stars. Each place was set, every plate already used, already cleaned, and yet still faintly warm, as though hands had just left them. But tonight there was one more. A new chair drawn at the head, its cushion slightly sunken, its wood whispering as if breathing after a long silence. She placed a small card upon the plate, a name carved not in ink but in relief, raised from the surface like scar tissue, pale and dry, letters that pulsed when the candlelight shifted. The name was unfamiliar, yet her mouth shaped it instinctively, as though she had been saying it in her sleep for years. "Welcome," she murmured, and the word felt wrong in the air, like a prayer said backward behind her. The empty room exhaled, soft and heavy. The sound of dust disturbed where no feet moved, and in the far mirror just beyond her reflection, the other guests sat waiting, not moving, not breathing, their eyes glazed with the patience of the long dead, outside the estate. The fog clung to the road like wool soaked in brine, and through it, a figure walked slowly, a lantern swinging from one hand, the other clutching a folded letter sealed with wax too red to be ink. He had not meant to come, that much he knew. The path had appeared where no path had been, and his horse had refused to follow, turning and breaking away as if from fire still. The letter had whispered when he tried to throw it aside, its edges burning cold against his fingers until he obeyed. Now he walked alone, the lantern's light revealing stones marked with initials, and every few paces a plate half buried in the mud, a fork standing upright like a grave marker. The gates of Hollowmarsh yawned before him, iron twisted into shapes resembling ribs, and as he pushed them open, they moaned like an old throat remembering speech inside. The house welcomed him without a host, the doors already ajar, the smell of roasted meat and sweet decay heavy in the air, somewhere deeper within. A chair scraped, slow, deliberate, like something waiting to be seen. The woman looked up, her humming stopping mid-note. She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. "You made good time," she whispered. "We were afraid the letter wouldn't find you." He hesitated in the doorway, his lantern flickering as the air grew colder. "Who's we?" he asked, but she was already turning toward the table, her hand gesturing to the empty chair, the one at the head where the nameplate glowed faintly. Breathing, he stepped closer despite himself, boots echoing on the floorboards that groaned as though beneath many feet. The table stretched endlessly, faces half seen in the dark, familiar and not, some watching, some pretending not to, each motionless but not lifeless. He leaned down to read the name, and felt his throat tighten. It was his own. The woman nodded, as though confirming something he had long denied. "We keep a place for all who are expected," she said softly, "and no one sets their own." He reached for the plate, but the silverware moved first, the knife turning slightly, the fork twitching like a startled insect. From beneath the table came a slow creak, a sound not of wood but of something breathing, heavy, rhythmic, ancient. He stumbled back, but the chair behind him had already pulled itself out, the napkin unfolding in the air like a sigh. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice nearly tender. "We cannot begin without you." Around him the candles brightened, revealing the others at last. Each guest perfectly still, their mouths sealed with wax, their eyes wet as though they'd been crying for centuries. He tried to run, but the air thickened, every breath turning to syrup, the light dimming again, as though the house had swallowed his motion whole. And in that suffocating silence, a new sound arose, a soft scratching beneath the tablecloth, something etching fresh letters into bone. Another name, one that wasn't his. The woman smiled faintly, smoothing the napkin again. "Another guest is on their way," she murmured. Her humming resumed, that same lullaby of obedience and mourning, as the candles steadied, their flames bending toward the door outside, down the fog-wrapped road. A lantern appeared, another traveller drawn toward Hollowmarsh, feeling suddenly terribly expected.